Questions are the heart of any attempt to really understand sales skills or influence skills. Unfortunately, most of what everybody's learned or been taught about questions is either wrong or superficial or, well, both, frankly. So what I want to do in this particular video is look at what questions really are and how they really work and how to make them as effective as possible in whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. Because that's kind of the starting point. Questions are not the answer. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. So let me first of all get a couple of common misconceptions out of the way, and then we can crack on with the real meaty goodness or creamy goodness in the middle of the skills session. There's this sort of very common misnomer, which is that open questions are good and closed questions are bad. Well, no, it really depends what you're trying to achieve. For example, what's the one word that you want more than anything else from a client or a candidate? Well, that's the word yes, isn't it? Now, try getting yes with an open question. Well, how do you mean, Stephen? Okay, open questions. How, what, why, where, when, who. How would you like to go ahead? Oh, yes. When would you like to start? Oh, yes. What? Okay, where do we go from here? Oh, yes. It doesn't work. Closed questions are terrific for getting the word yes, for getting agreement, for getting compliance, for getting things moving forwards. They're not bad. They're just lousy for pulling information from somebody. See what I mean about it? Depends on context, depends what you're trying to use them for. Open questions are not necessarily good. Closed questions are not necessarily bad. It depends at what stage in the conversation or the process you're at and what you're trying to achieve next. So let me just recap first of all. You've probably done this a million times, but just in case. Open questions. Open questions tend to start with how, what, why, where, when, who. I've put a little piece of Rudyard Kipling on the screen as well. How, what, why, where, when, who. Now, is it possible to answer those questions that start with those words with a yes or a no? Absolutely. Is it possible to ask a perfectly good question that starts with how, what, why, where, when, who, and get either no real response or information that doesn't really take you anywhere? Absolutely. You know, you ask an open question and somebody goes, yeah, I suppose so. How often have you heard that sort of thing? Or they go, well, this and this. And it doesn't really give you any information. There's no buy-in, there's no content, there's no real information coming out of it. Because closed questions aren't bad. Open questions aren't good. I tend to separate things instead into useful and useless. So when you're getting to close a conversation or close a deal, closed questions, useful. When you're trying to draw information out from somebody, well, open questions aren't always useful. Depends how you ask them. Like the old saying has it, it ain't what you do, it's the way what you do it. Well, that applies completely to questioning skills. Now, I went through a very conventional, very traditional kind of sales and marketing training. In my 20s, I went through lots of sales training courses. I became a member of the Chartered Institute of Marketing in the UK. You know, I went through all the conventional stuff. And along the way, you know, I did what I was taught because, you know, I'm a good student. And I'm very coachable. I mean, ridiculously coachable. So I did what I was taught. And, you know, it kind of worked, sort of. But sometimes I just find myself going... thump, thump. And that's the sound of me banging my head against a brick wall, where I would do all the open questions and I just wouldn't get anything back from somebody. And it was that kind of frustration. And once I'd started my own firm and I was teaching people the same stuff that I'd learned, and the sense of frustration was just like palpable, because I knew that these outliers I kept bumping into, people who were achieving sort of ridiculously good results, weren't doing or using the techniques that I've been taught and that I was teaching other people. It was hugely frustrating. It was just like, if you're one of those people that has that thing about when you rub your nails on a chalkboard, it was like that for me. And it was just hugely irritating because I knew there was something different, but I didn't know what it was. And as a result of that, I just started looking for information and looking for different ways of doing things. And when it came to questions, it was really interesting because the answer came to me from the most sort of unexpected source. If you've followed any of my stuff, if you've watched any of the previous videos in the packages, or if you've watched me on social media, you've probably heard me say that I've been on every conceivable training course about every conceivable topic, if it relates to sales or influence. Well, one of the things I did was learn hypnosis skills from Paul McKenna, who is not around so much anymore, but Paul probably still is one of the world's greatest hypnotists. And you're back in the room. No, I'm joking, chill. But the thing with hypnosis is that it doesn't work the way most people think it does. It's not all kind of woo, voodoo, casting spells rubbish. It's just talking to people and just creating a pattern of influence. And something Paul said very early in the training just kind of bing, set off a light bulb in my head, because he pointed out that the hypnosis-y part, where you're talking directly, look into my eyes, look not around my eyes, directly into my eyes, and all that kind of stuff. That's not the important part. The important part is what happens before. It's what happens while you're talking with somebody. It's what happens while they're setting up the appointment. It's what happens from the moment they walk into the room. And that's what someone like Darren Brown or Paul McKenna or me or whoever has really sort of taken on board. So if you're trying to influence somebody, it's not an act. It's not a thing that you do. It's everything that you do. And I'll talk about that on subsequent videos in different places. But that whole pattern. But it's not what happens while you're talking to somebody. It's what happens before. And in parlance, that's called the setup. Now, the setup, it suddenly went bang, I got it. I just understood. It's like everything I'd learned and watched suddenly went bing, 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 and dropped into the pattern. And I got it. So let me explain to you how questions actually work if you're trying to get information and build rapport and motivation and drive your deals forwards in the most effective and the most straightforward way possible, taking people with you without any perceivable resistance, asking questions and getting information from people, really having a great conversation, at the end of which the obvious conclusion is that, yeah, great, let's go ahead. Because that's what we're really looking for, is a great conversation, at the end of which the obvious conclusion is, yeah, let's go ahead. Does that make sense? Brilliant. So let me explain, first of all, the structure of a question. Hang on, Stephen, I ask a question and they answer it. No, honestly, no, that's just not right. And that is why most of the stuff that people learn about questions doesn't work, because we focus on the question. But the question is only part of the process, because the chances are, if you're going to ask somebody a question and get an answer from them, you're probably having a conversation. There's probably stuff that happens before and the stuff that happens afterwards. And let me give you another example. Have you ever been in a conversation with somebody, somebody's trying to sell you something, and it's quite blatant that they are working their way through a checklist or a poorly written script? So, have you got this? Have you got that? Do you do this? What do you do about that? When do you do the other? Where does that? And they're literally going through their checklist. There's no conversation, there's no flow, there's no real organic element to it. It's just a series of unrelated questions. And when you answer those unrelated questions, what you get back is another question. You ever been on the end of that? If you haven't, I hope you never do, because it's hugely frustrating. It just makes me want to pull what's left of my hair out. You're like, oh God, talk with me. Have a conversation with me. Stop asking me questions. Stop talking at me. Just let's have a conversation, because that is what sales and influence is really about. A conversation that leads to the inevitable conclusion that, yeah, let's go ahead. And that's what we're trying to build on. So, okay, how does conversation work then? How do questions work outside of a sales context? And one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was from an early mentor of mine who said, look, stop trying to work out what people do. Stop trying to work out how they do it. Just watch, observe, and learn. Like, okay. And I just started watching people and listening to people while they were having conversations. And when I watched enough people just chatting and getting along perfectly well and having nice relationships with each other and just, talking, being people, after enough observation, I kind of went, oh yeah, that's how a conversation works. So I'm going to start the skills part of this by explaining the difference between a conversation and an interrogation. An interrogation is what most salespeople do. An interrogation is what most recruitment consultants do. It consists of a series of pre-planned questions to which you want the information because that information will be useful for you. In other words, it's all about you getting something from them. Not a great basis for a relationship, you'd think. I mean, don't get me wrong, we've all been there, but that's not the ideal situation. A conversation is where you're exchanging views, exchanging information, exploring somebody else's opinions and their motivations and their reasons for stuff. Just, having a back and forth where you exchange information, you exchange views, and you gain a better understanding of each other. That's a conversation. A conversation could equally just be where you're exchanging stories and just bantering back and forth, and you're just sort of getting to know each other better. That's still perfectly valid in the context of being a recruitment consultant, because at some point you need to know the customer and the candidate well enough to make a match for them. So if we look at conversation is not an exchange of facts. If you go out for an evening with your friends, do you all get together, you've got a drink of some kind in your hand, whether alcoholic or not, and do you then sit there and exchange facts? Probably not. To be fair, my partner and I do. We kind of really like a good fact. But most of the time, you swap stories. You tell jokes, which are stories with a punchline. You just talk about, oh, do you remember when? Or, oh, well, what about? Or, oh, I heard about this the other day. You just, you don't exchange facts. You exchange stories, and you talk about those stories with each other, and you build on those stories with each other, and that's how conversation actually works. To be a bit more scientific about it, a conversation has 4 parts to it. The first part, as I mentioned earlier, is the setup. It's what comes before the question. Then there's the question itself. Now, most sales skill stuff just goes question, and it ignores the really important bit. The really important bit is their response. It's almost as though we sales trainers kind of assume that if you ask somebody a question, they will automatically give you a full and comprehensive response with every element you might require. Yeah, people aren't like that. That's not how it works. So, setup, question, response. Now, the response is their answer. It's the information they give you, which may or may not be what you're looking for. It may or may not be comprehensive. It may or may not actually be relevant to the topic. If it's not, that tells you got the setup wrong, by the way. But then what? Well, then I ask them another question and I gain more information because I'm in a fact find. No. That's an interrogation. A conversation is very different. If you ask me a question and I answer it, what am I now looking for? I'm looking for you to respond to what I just said. I'm looking to know that you've heard me. I'm looking to know that you take me seriously, or you find me funny, or that you're interested in me. And if you just change the topic and ask another question, how am I going to feel? Well, I've got relationship interrupters. You know, I've got conversation interrupters. I'm just kind of, okay. And the more you do that, the less seriously I feel I'm being taken, the less I'm being heard. And the less I'm being heard, the less I'm going to give. Does that make sense? So the question process is setup, question, response, follow-up. The follow-up is where you ask additional questions, where you get more information. So let's say you're having a conversation and somebody starts talking about when they went on holiday and they saw this, you know, they went swimming with the dolphins. And you go, oh mate, that's amazing. What was that like? What was that like? What was that like is your follow-up in the conversation to them saying that they went swimming with dolphins. Oh my God, how many were there? Oh, that's amazing. I mean, were they friendly or they just ignored you or what? That's the follow-up that you would do perfectly naturally in a conversation. Unless you're, you know, like me, massively socially awkward. But let's assume that you're a normal human being. Somebody says they went swimming with dolphins. You'd ask them questions about it. You have a bit of a conversation about what they just said. See what I mean? So it's set up, what comes before the question, their response, their answer, and then the follow-up. You asking for more information, you digging in deeper so that you understand exactly what they mean and how and why. So yes, most of the questions that you can ask are going to be open questions. How, what, why, where, when, who. But that isn't necessarily true of the follow-up questions. Those could be closed questions, they could be open questions. What you're using them for is to dig down deeper so that you get a better understanding of what somebody's meaning, what they're talking about, what the real information is. So those are the 4 stages. Let me break them down into a little bit more detail, a little bit more granular detail, so that you can really get better at every element of it. So let's first of all look at the setup. Now there are lots of elements that go into the setup, or could go into the setup. I'm going to focus on 2 at this point, give you the most important ones. The setup is what gives somebody the chance to answer properly, fully, in detail. So let me give you an example. If I just said to you, what's your favourite fish? What? Fish what? You mean to look at, to eat? I don't really eat. What? If I just ask you a random question with no context, it's an open question. What? What's your favourite fish? I don't know. I can ask you an open question. How'd you get to work today? I'm not in what? Just completely random, open question. Now, you may have the ability to give me a really good answer to that question, but unless you're already thinking about the topic, just a complete out the blue, non sequitur, out the flow of the conversation question is very unlikely to get a comprehensive, meaningful answer. Does that make sense? If you've ever asked somebody a question and they've gone, what? That response tells you that there was either no setup or an ineffective setup to the conversation. You've basically just interrupted their pattern completely. Now there's a place and a time for pattern interrupts. This isn't it. While we're having a conversation with somebody, whatever stage of the process we may be at, whether it's we're at cold outreach, or whether we're trying to get the best offer for somebody, or whether we're trying to drive the interview process through, whatever stage of that process we're at, if we're trying to have a conversation with somebody, we want to avoid interrupting the pattern. We want to avoid dropping things in out the blue. We want the conversation to flow in the direction that we want it to flow. You with me on that? Okay, so the setup is what comes before the question, so that the question gets the best possible response. And if the question gives you a really good response, that means that your follow-up is easy and gives you lots of information and is really comprehensive, which means that you can then set up the next question, which gives you a good response, which gives you the ability to follow up and get more detail, which sets up the next. You with me? It becomes a wonderful, virtuous circle where the person that you're talking with just feels like they're having a conversation. They're not having an interrogation. You know, they're not under the bright lights being beaten up. They are having a nice chat with somebody who kind of gets them, who's interested in them. And it's probably interesting, because there's no better way to be interesting than to be interested. Just a thought. So, setup. The setup, if you want to make it really effective, will have some combination of two things. The first is an inoculation. So if there's a potential reason, very likely, very probable reason, that somebody might have a problem answering the question. So if the information you're looking for is a bit confidential, or it's a bit potentially controversial, you would use an inoculation. You may have heard me talk about inoculations in different contexts, but let me just explain it for you anyway. Inoculation, vaccination, whatever your views on vax and COVID are, let's just park those to the side for now, shall we? The concept of an inoculation is that you give somebody a weak version of the objection, so that even if the objection comes up, you don't get a really serious, full-blown version of it. You just get sort of weak, half-hearted, kind of, well, I feel like I'm supposed to say, so I'll say it, kind of thing. So let's say that you're asking for information that's a bit confidential, controversial. I might, as part of my setup, say to somebody, look, I know this is potentially a bit confidential, a bit controversial. I do need to ask, though, just to kind of get a real understanding of where we're at. That's an inoculation. I've acknowledged the potential objection, and I've explained why I'm going to ask anyway. So I know this might be a bit controversial. I just need to get into it, though, so I can get a thorough understanding of where we need to go next. It's as simple as that. I used to make it much more complicated. I could talk about inoculations for hours. I have at various points. And maybe if we get into things on a more extensive basis together, we'll get into them in a bit more detail. But in general terms, all we need to do is acknowledge and then explain why we're going to do the thing anyway. So, I know this might be an unusual question. I'm just asking because I need to get more of a context. Yeah, this might seem like it's a little bit, out of the ballpark. It's a little bit unusual. It's a bit weird. But the reason I'm asking is because now that setup does two things. The first is it inoculates. And by inoculating, it means that, can somebody go, well, yeah, that is actually quite confidential and that is a bit unusual. Okay. Yeah. Even if they refuse to give you the information, they're not offended. Because you've acknowledged, you've told them that you understand what they're feeling and thinking, so they have more of a sense of empathy with you than before you ask the question, which is nice. But the other thing it does is it gets somebody ready. So first of all, minimizes the objection, but secondly, it gets somebody ready for the fact that there's a change of topic coming. It gets somebody mentally ready for the fact that, okay, there's something serious coming here. So that inoculation is hugely useful if you're asking a question that's unusual, controversial, confidential, a bit personal or probing. You don't need to inoculate before every single question. You don't even need to inoculate against every potential objection that somebody might have, because you'd be there all day and you'd sound like an idiot. Done that. When I first developed this technique, yeah, I would go completely over the top, because I test everything to destruction so that you don't have to. So yeah, I've been there. I've looked like a complete idiot on your behalf. Anyway, but one thing you will need every time is what we call a focus phrase. And a focus phrase typically is something like thinking about, or looking forward to, or looking back on. So let's just stick with those three for now. Thinking about, looking forward to, looking back on. Okay, now let me explain what those are about. I gave you the example earlier on of, I just drop a completely random question at you and I just go, what's your favourite fish? You go, Now this time, by the way, when I just said, what's your favourite fish? You probably had some kind of answer swimming around in your head. You sort of did there, swimming. Anyway, you probably found it easier to answer because you've been mentally prepared for it a few minutes ago. So if I say to you, just looking back over the last 2 or 3 years, that focus phrase engages the memory. If I say, just looking forward, the next 12, 24 months, it's now engaged your imagination, your motivation, your goals. If I say thinking about, and then I name a topic, your brain is now on that topic, because the human brain is fundamentally is a question and answer device. You ask your brain a question, it will come up with an answer. Slight diversion for a second, which is why asking yourself, I said earlier right at the start, there are the useful questions and useless questions. Well, to kind of dig into that a little bit more, there are also bloody stupid questions. Like, why does it always happen to me? And your brain will go, because you deserve it. Or, why can't I succeed? Oh, because you're too stupid, too young, too old, wrong gender. Or, please stop asking yourself stupid questions. Ask yourself smart questions. And your brain is capable of amazing stuff if you get out your own way. Your brain will give you fantastic answers if you ask it the right questions. But let me come back to the topic. So think about it for a second. Let's say you're talking with a friend about a holiday. Would you say simply, what was the name of the bartender in Corfu? What? Sorry, what? Corfu where? It wouldn't work. What you would do is say, oh, you remember when we were in Corfu and we were staying in the hotel, and when you went out the door, on the right-hand side, there was that nice sandy beach. Well, there were those 3 bars, and the one we always went to was the one in the middle. And, we got really friendly with the bartender there. And oh God, what was his name? What was the name of that bartender? Boom, Stelios. Your friend will give you that answer because they've got their head into the context. They can access their memories and they can give you the answer. If you just throw a question out at somebody, you're quite likely to hit a brick wall because the brain isn't engaged yet. So if you engage somebody with the setup, the focus phrase, before you ask the question, you'll get much, much better responses. So instead of saying to somebody, what's the difference between a good candidate and an outstanding candidate? To which the answer is, oh, I never really thought about it. It's okay. Well, in your experience, if you think back about, hires you've made that have been absolutely brilliant, and other times when it's been, it's not been a disaster, but it's been sort of okay. They've stayed with you well, but they've not really blown the doors off. What would you say the difference is between somebody who's okay and somebody who is absolutely outstanding? Now you'll get an answer. Now you're going to have a conversation with somebody. Do you see where I'm going with this? So there are any number of different focus phrases that you could use. I've tested and tried out, literally dozens. In reality, I tend to just focus on those 3. Focus, no mind. I tend to just use those 3. I tend to use thinking about, looking back on, or if you remember, looking forward to. And those 3 phrases or variations on them, depending on who you're talking with, they will prime somebody's imagination or memories or engage their thought processes. And that allows them to answer really well and give you massive amounts of detail and information. And because they give you massive amounts of detail and information, that means that you've got loads of stuff to follow up on. And when you follow up on it and dig down into that detail and information, that shows the other person that you're taking them seriously and that you've really heard them, which means that when you set up the next question, it's even easier to engage them and get more information from them. You see that virtuous circle at work? That's kind of what I'm talking about. That's how you do it. Now, pro tip for you. Pro tip! Here's the pro tip. The basic rule is long setup, short question, long answer. What most people do when they're learning this particular technique, and I get it, I absolutely get it. What most people do is they do a short setup, they ask a really long question with lots of pieces to it and lots of clauses and sub-clauses and lots of different elements to it, as a result of which they get a short answer. I don't know, really. Oh, how do you mean? Oh, by the way, if somebody ever says to you, how do you mean? When you've asked them a question, that tells you your setup was a disaster or didn't exist, or the question had about 14 commas in it. Let me give you an example. So, if you're looking at the ideal candidate, what do you find most important? Is it personality, culture fit? Is it, their background and experience, their skills? What would you say? What am I supposed to answer? Which bit of that? Instead, long setup. When you think about bringing a really good candidate on board, there's always loads of things you can consider. You've got personality, culture fit, skills, experience, all sorts of things you could bring into the mix. What's important for you for bringing in a really good candidate? Short question, that will get you a long answer because you've had their brain focus. With the focus phrase, there's lots of things to think about, lots of things you could consider. List them. There's this, there's that, there's the other, there's the third, there's loads of things and there's all this. There's a million things you could think about. But when you're bringing on a candidate, what's really important for you? And then you'll get a long and comprehensive answer. Now, it will take practice, but you've probably heard me hammering on about this. It's one of those things that most people haven't really thought through. The important thing about questions is not the question. Honestly, that's the easy bit. Any competent coach could give you a list of a couple of hundred questions that will always be useful for recruitment consultants. I could probably narrow it down to about 12. Not going to, because those questions will fail if you don't set them up properly. And the whole conversation will fail if you don't follow up properly on what they say. Now, the follow-up stage is relatively straightforward. The follow-up stage consists of opening your damned ears, and if you're on a Zoom call with somebody or if you're face-to-face with somebody, opening your damned eyes and recognizing, really listening, really watching, taking in what they actually say. Ask the question, shut the hell up, and listen. Focus. Because they will give you everything you need if you let them and if you will absorb it. So take it all in and then just ask them for a bit more detail. Oh, you mentioned this. In what way? How do you mean? Could you give me an example? My favourite follow-up questions are simple things like, how do you mean? In what way? Could you give me an example? Simple, open questions. How do you mean? In what way? Oh, where would that happen? How would that apply? When would you do that? Simple, very straightforward, very short questions, because once you've got the other person talking, set up the question, ask them a useful short question, they answer it, they're now talking. So the key thing here is to keep them talking. Follow up. In what way? How do you mean? Where would that work? How would you go about that? Could you give me an example? What's your definition? Those sorts of key questions. And then once you've really pulled all the information out that you can, imagine, the image I tend to use is I've got a really friendly little Spanish water dog. You've probably seen her on social media. She's the softest, sheepiest looking thing, because Spanish water dogs are sheep-sized and they've got flat backs like a sheep, and they're designed to just hang about in the middle of the flock, and they're just really nice and friendly and soft and charming, and just really nice little creatures to have around. But give them a bone with a bit of marrow in it, and Puddles, my little Spanish water dog, will just keep chewing on that bone to get all the marrow out. And when she's got all the marrow out, she'll flip the bone over and have another look, see if there's anything left. Same sort of thing with the follow-up, but hopefully without the claws. Just keep probing, just keep looking for extra information. Once you've got all the information out from this response, then you're ready to set up the next question. And what you'll find, by the way, is that instead of having your checklist of a dozen questions, you might only need 2 or 3, because you'll get everything you could possibly need from 2 or 3 really well-phrased questions, rather than having to ask dozens of sort of vague or probing questions, because you're not really getting the information or the buy-in from somebody. So that's the 4-stage process. Setup, which consists of focus phrase and possibly inoculations. The question, which is an open question: how, what, why, where, when, who. The other person's response, and then the follow-up. The follow-up is where you get more and more detail. How do you mean? In what way? Could you give me an example? Where would that happen? How would you go about that? Could you give me an example? What's your definition? All of those sorts of things, which then will lead logically into the setup for the next question. Now, most recruitment consultants will have been given or will have created some kind of list of questions or some kind of checklist of questions. If you haven't, I'd suggest you do. What's the key information that you need from a candidate? What's the key information you need from a client? Please, I'm not talking purely about the fact find. I'm not talking about the qualification of the CV or that sort of stuff. This process does work very well for that. If you want real detail from somebody, this process is really powerful for that. But what I'm mainly talking about here, because this is about billings and improving your revenue, is when it comes to influencing and taking the deal process forwards. So if you're just starting out with this, come up with a list of the questions that you want to ask someone in order to really engage them. And then think about this question. Now that, by the way, think about this question. You are now prepped and waiting for me to say something important because I've set it up. See what I mean? I'm practicing what I preach. So think about this. What do they need to think about or remember or imagine to answer your question as comprehensively as possible? What do they need to think about or remember or imagine to answer your question as comprehensively as possible? And that is your setup. That is your focus phrase, because that is what you're going to have them think about before you ask them the question. So let's say you are using it for qualifying a candidate. One of the common questions is, what have your key achievements been over the last 3 years? You could turn around to somebody and say, just looking back over the last 3 years, there'll have been some stuff that's gone well, some stuff that's gone not so well. There'll be some stuff you look back on and kind of go, and there'll be some other stuff that you go, oh, yeah, that was me. Just looking back over the last 3 years, what would you say your key achievements have been? That will get you an answer. That will get you something you can really use. And it will also change the other person's perspective on you, because everything in that focus phrase tells them that you understand them, that you relate to them, that you get it. So one of the wonderful byproducts of all this, and by now you'll hopefully start to realise that everything I talk about is connected in one way or another. One of the wonderful byproducts from this is when you set up a question well, it shows the other person that you know what you're doing. It shows the other person that you understand them and their situation, and it instantly boosts your personal credibility, which is no bad byproduct. You know, having a byproduct of gaining all the information you want is that you also look like an expert. How great is that? And that is what you can get from setting up your questions well. Take the time, invest the time to get really good at setting up your questions and following up your questions and making your questions as short as possible. And if you can do those three things, set them up properly, shorten the questions down and follow up on them, everything in your recruitment career will get better as a result of that thing. I know that's a big old claim. That's a big hairy ass claim. Yes, it is, but it's true. Do the work and this will transform every conversation that you have. Clients, candidates, internal peers and colleagues, everything. I don't often make big hairy ass claims for my techniques and frameworks. This one I will do. This makes everything else work. Have some fun with it.